and welcome to another episode on Day-to-Day Christians. Welcome back. We're getting straight back into where we left off in Genesis, and that's into getting into the story surrounding Jacob, who has now been named by God Israel. And in the next chapters and all the way until the end of Genesis, we actually have the story of one of his sons, his favorite son, Joseph. So let's get into it. So here we see in the beginning of chapter 37 that Jacob is now living in the land of Canaan. And there one of his youngest sons, Joseph, is 17 years of age. And right at the start here, we can see that Jacob loved Joseph more than the rest of his sons and showed that in the form of making Joseph a robe made of lots of colors, like a rainbow dress for him to wear as a sign of kind of being his favorite and being so loved by his father Israel. Now from verse 5, we have Joseph here showing us for the first time his kind of God-given skill and talent of deciphering dreams. Here we see that Joseph has his first dream, which he interprets to his brothers. I should have mentioned already that it was very obvious to the rest of Joseph's brothers, the 11 brothers that he had, that their father loved him more than the rest of them. And for this, they actually hated Joseph. So when Joseph came to them and told them of this dream, it didn't improve his situation with his brothers. So this is the dream that Joseph told his brothers. Behold, we were building sheaves in the fields, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And in verse 8 it says, are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us? And they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Joseph, not really learning his lesson the first time, had another dream and decided once more to tell his brothers about it. And Joseph said, behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowed down to me. And it goes on in verse 10 to say this. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the saying in mind. So really quick, we can see already a few distinct features that are really important, which are going to carry through the end of Genesis. The first thing is that Joseph, one of the youngest sons of Jacob, who's now Israel, is the favorite, and because of this is then hated by his brothers, his 11 brothers, most of which are older than him. And secondly, we start to see that Joseph has a knack for kind of deciphering dreams. In these two dreams, he isn't stating what he thinks they are to mean, but they are fairly obvious in their presentation, and the brothers and the father are kind of figure it out for themselves. So this is pretty amazing, seeing how Joseph is 17 years of age and doesn't have that much wisdom, but is able to distinctly identify these dreams as being important and maybe messages from God. And lastly, both of these dreams are kind of prophecies for what's going to happen at the end of Genesis and in Joseph's life. So let's get into the more of the story and find out how it happens that Joseph, being one of the youngest of his family, comes to get into a position where his family comes and bows down to him. So from verse 12, we have the story which goes into detail about Joseph's brothers selling him to become a slave. In verse 13, we see Israel sending off Joseph to find his brothers and to bring back the word of the works that they have been doing in the field. Joseph inevitably finds them in a town called Dothan. But in verse 18, we see that as Joseph is approaching this town, his brothers spot him and start conspiring to kill Joseph out of the hatred they had for him. They have the idea of suggesting that a fierce animal devoured him in the wilderness as he was traveling to them. But when Reuben, the oldest of the sons, heard this, he kind of saves Joseph in a way and says, let's not hurt our brother, but is open to other things happening to him. So he comes up with an idea to throw Joseph into a pit in the middle of the wilderness. And that's exactly what the brothers did. They stripped Joseph of his colourful robe, which his father had made him, and threw him into this pit in the middle of the wilderness with no food and no water. They then sat down, the brothers, a distance away to eat. And then in the distance, they saw a caravan coming, and they recognized the caravan for being Ishmaelites. And they decide to, rather than hurt their brother, sell their brother off as a slave to these Ishmaelites that are coming. But in verse 28, we see that before the brothers were actually able to get to the pit to sell off Joseph themselves, some Midianites came by, some Midianite traders, and they saw Joseph in the pit, lifted him up, and rather than rescuing him, they sold him off to the Ishmaelite caravan for 20 pieces of silver themselves. And so the Ishmaelites took Joseph as a slave to Egypt. And from verse 29, we have the story of what the brothers decided to do next. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe into the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. He refused to be comforted, thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. All right, so a few key points of information that we need to take into account here is that now Jacob, Israel, believes that his favorite son is dead. He has evidence. The brothers came and brought with them the cloak that he had made for his favorite son, drenched in blood that he believed to be his son's blood, but he was unaware it was actually the blood of a goat. It was probably torn as well, and that Jacob, Israel, was mourning greatly for the loss of his son. We see the deceitfulness and the hatred in the brothers for doing this thing, and the failure to actually do it themselves. They first decided to kill them, and then Reuben stood up and said, "No, we're not going to hurt him," which was, he could have done more, but at least they did that. They didn't hurt him and they didn't kill him. And then when they had the idea to sell him off as a slave, someone else got to him first. So they didn't reap any reward out of the situation other than the fact they now don't have the brother which they hated, and they hated because of the dreams and the favoritism he had through his father. And then lastly, this little point of information right at the end, that Joseph was sold into the service of the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. So an important person in Egypt is now in charge of Joseph. And this becomes really important later on. But for now, let's get back into the story and find out what happens to Joseph. So now we get into chapter 39. Once again, we have it written down that Joseph is now under the service of Potiphar, the head of the Egyptian guard, a high-ranking officer in the court of the Pharaoh. In verse 2, it says that the Lord was with Joseph and made him a successful man. And it goes on to explain how and why. And it says down here that Joseph was made and put into the position of the head of the house. So kind of like the head servant in a way for this officer. He was done so because the officer could see that the Lord was with him and that everything Joseph touched succeeded and worked well, and he was able to do everything that was in or given to him as his responsibilities. And it's written here that the only thing Potiphar had to worry about or concern himself with at home was what he ate. So we can see here that Joseph had ascended himself into the highest position inside the house to this officer of the court. Joseph also asked the Lord to bless the house for his sake, and the Lord did so. Now this chapter starts really getting into the main story at the end of verse 6 and at the start of verse 7. At the end of verse 6, it says that Joseph was a very handsome man, or became a very handsome man. Now, this is kind of important because the wife to Potiphar, who was living at home, probably being a higher up's wife, not having much to do, started having eyes or started liking the look of Joseph and pursued him and actually asked Joseph to lie with her. And Joseph, of course, being a godly man, a man that we can see already walks with God, refuses. But she doesn't give up. She keeps trying at him. And it says here in verse 10 that she tries day after day to try and sleep and lie with Joseph. For Joseph, in verse 11, what we have is rather unfortunate. He's ascended to this position in the house. He's well respected by Potiphar, and he's put, it actually says here that inside the house he's at the same level of the guardsmen, that they are almost equals inside the house, because Joseph is the main person in charge of the house. Because in verse 11 we see that Joseph is left alone in the house with Potiphar's wife, and she takes this opportunity to kind of grab him and clutch his clothing and ask again and somewhat demand for him to lie with her. He of course refuses and actually takes off his clothing, his garment, and runs out. But she takes this opportunity, probably being rather insulted that he keeps rejecting her. And what she does is she then calls out for more servants in the household to come back into the house. And she claims that Joseph was trying to laugh at her and was actually the one trying to lie with her. And she commits to this story all the way until the husband, Potiphar, comes back home, and she says a story about how he came in, tried to lie with her, and then once she screamed, he just got up and ran and left his clothing behind. And of course, she had his clothing there. And so that was kind of evidence for the story that she was making up. And so we saw that Potiphar got so angry about this. Obviously, he's going to take the word of his wife over the word of his servant, even though Joseph was doing such an amazing job and had so much responsibilities, and he could see that he was a man that walked with God. He was still angry at him, and what resulted in this situation is that Joseph was then sent to prison, and not just any prison, but the king's prison. In verse 21, it says, although this has happened to him, although this is another huge blow for Joseph in his life, the Lord always gave him steadfast love and was with him in all times and with all things. And the Lord gave favor to Joseph in the eyes of the keepers of the prison, where in verse 22 we see that the keepers make Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. So yet again we see that wherever he is entrusted with responsibilities that he's seen as a point of authority, and he's always put into a point of authority. And here we have Joseph hitting a new low, being in the king's prison, a terrible place to be, but put in charge of all of the other prisoners, and the keepers then have nothing to worry about because they know Joseph is in charge and that everything he does, he succeeds in. At the start of chapter 40, we learn that the main cupbearer for the Pharaoh, a really high-ranking position, and the king's baker, they committed crimes against the Pharaoh and their lord and king of Egypt. And as a result, they were both sent to the same prison via the head of the guard, the man that used to be the lord of Joseph. And Joseph was put in charge of them in the prison and attended to their needs. This chapter is the story of how Joseph correctly interprets the dreams these two men had. So in verse 5, it starts off by telling us that both of these men had a dream. By verse 6, Joseph identifies that they are both troubled and finds out that they are both troubled because of their dreams which they had. We see at the end of verse 8 that Joseph states that all interpretations of dreams belong to God. This is a glimpse into the relationship Joseph has with God, where he honors all that he has, all the skills that he's able to manage to God and his wisdom. He's able to recognize that his ability to interpret dreams comes directly from God. So in verse 9, we have the chief cupbearer telling Joseph his dream. And this is what he says. In my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And in verse 13, Joseph goes about interpreting the dream for the cupbearer. And this is what he says. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. So Joseph here is saying that the first dream, the cupbearer's dream, means that he will be saved from the prison, that he will be restored to his high-ranking position that he once had. And then he asks him, when this happens, please remember me and have favor for me, or bring favor to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh, that I am not meant to be here. And when the baker sees and hears this good interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, he gets excited and wants to tell Joseph his dream. And this is what it says. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And in verse 19, we have Joseph interpreting the dream for the baker. And this is what he says. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. So Joseph here delivering the not so good news that this man is condemned and that in 3 days he shall die. And after these interpretations, in verse 20, we see that in 3 days' time, it's the Pharaoh's birthday, and he hosts a great feast and has all of his servants with him and asks for these 2 men to be presented before him. And just as Joseph had interpreted the dreams, so it came to pass. The cupbearer was reinstated to his position, and the baker was hung. Although what Joseph asked of the cupbearer did not come to pass, and the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and didn't mention him to Pharaoh. Alright, so for chapter 41, I'm actually going to read through from verse 1 all the way up until verse 9. And read along with me, and we're going to get into the story surrounding the Pharaoh's dream that he has, which Joseph inevitably interprets. So let's get into it. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed on the red grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So there are the two dreams that Pharaoh had that are disturbing him. Both very similar in the way that they have 7 of good things, 7 of bad things. And then it goes about in verse 9 that the main cupbearer, Pharaoh's cupbearer, sees that no one is able to interpret these dreams, but remembers his time in prison 2 years ago when that man, Joseph, was able to interpret his dream correctly, as well as the other man, the baker's dream. So he tells Pharaoh this, and immediately Pharaoh demands and commands that they bring Joseph to him so that he can interpret his dream. They clean Joseph up a bit and present him to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to Joseph that he hears that he is able to interpret other people's dreams. And we see here yet again the faith Joseph has by saying to Pharaoh that it's not him that is able to interpret dreams, but it's God's will, and it's God that is enabled to interpret dreams, and he is just the tool. And so from verse 17 we have a restatement of the two dreams that Pharaoh says to Joseph. And immediately Joseph says to Pharaoh that the two dreams are one, and that in them God is explaining what Pharaoh needs to do. He tells Pharaoh that what these dreams mean is that there will be 7 plentiful years to come where crops and livestock will flourish. And then straight away following these 7 years, there will be another 7 years of famine, a great famine, a famine that would swallow up all of the crops and the prosperous harvests that had happened in the previous good years. And then following this, he says to Pharaoh that what God is asking him to do is that to prepare for these years of famine. And Joseph depicts a way that he's able to do this. Joseph says to Pharaoh that he should pick a wise man to make in charge of all of Egypt's lands and all of its crops and fields. And that this man should take 1/5 of all that is brought in from these 7 good years, so that when the 7 years of famine happen, they will have reserves and will have enough food to help his kingdom survive and make it through the bad years of famine. In verse 37, we see that this proposal pleases Pharaoh and that he's happy with this interpretation. And that Pharaoh says, how should we be able to find a man to do this great task? And then this is when something really interesting happens. Pharaoh decides that because Joseph is able to interpret his dreams, and that Joseph has said that is God's will that has given him the ability to interpret these dreams, Pharaoh decides to make that man Joseph. And in verse 40, the Pharaoh says that you shall be over my house, and that all shall do as you command and bow to you. What this means is when Joseph was the head of the house of a really higher up commander for the Egyptian court, and it was a great status in that house. But now he's been elevated way above that to the head of Pharaoh's house. And we see down the chapters that the Pharaoh says, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And that the Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And then he puts great clothes and jewelry on Joseph. And Joseph follows behind the Pharaoh in the second chariot. And people call out so that they will bow down to Joseph as he comes past them. I'm probably going to get this wrong, but it says in verse 45 that the Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah. And he also gave Joseph a wife, Asnath. And we find out in verse 46 that Joseph was 30 years old when this had happened. So what this means is that Joseph was put into that pit by his brothers when he was 17. So that means 13 years had passed by this point. And Joseph's life has been surely like a roller coaster with ups and downs. But all the way through, he's stuck by God. And God has constantly been giving his favor to him. And he's been walking with God. And so Joseph went about doing all that he said should be done. And in verse 49 it says, "And Joseph stored up grain in abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured." And then in the next verse, we hear that Joseph then has 2 sons with his wife. And he names the oldest one Manasseh and the second born Ephraim. And then the years of famine came, and all the land was without grain and bread. But thanks to Joseph, there was stocks full in the warehouse-like areas that Joseph had created, full of bread and grain for people to purchase. And the people cried out to Pharaoh to help them in this time of famine. And the Pharaoh just replies to the people, "Go to Joseph. What he says to do, do." So Joseph opens up the storehouses and sells to the Egyptians. And then it also says at the end of the chapter that the rest of the world was suffering from this famine as well, and that all came to buy from the stocks that Joseph had saved during the good years of harvest. So in this last chapter, we see that Joseph has ascended to a new height, a level that really can't be surpassed unless he becomes the Pharaoh himself. He is put second in charge of Egypt, and Egypt at this time is an incredibly powerful and influential place on earth and in this area of the world. Joseph is put in charge of all of this stock and all of this wealth of grain and food that everyone needs in this desperate time, because he shows Pharaoh that he walks hand in hand with God. So if anything, what we can take from Joseph's life so far, and there's more to come, is that no matter what trials and tribulations we have in life, if we put God first and walk hand in hand with him, he will allow us to prosper, and he will allow us to be given all the success and all the things that we need, and will ascend us to the heights that he has made for us. Well, I hope you liked this video, guys, and I hope you're interested in this story of Joseph. It's going to continue in our next videos as we continue through the story of Joseph and when his family come and find out where he is and find out that he is alive. Please like and subscribe and comment on this video and what you want to see in the future. And I'll see you guys really soon in the next video. Bye for now. God bless.